You are sitting waist deep in a rotting, mosquito-infested trench on an island like Guadalcanal. The heat is suffocating, pressing down on you like a wet, heavy blanket. Your uniform is practically disintegrating off your back in the humid air. You haven't seen a fresh supply drop in weeks. Half your platoon is suffering from debilitating malaria, and you are barely surviving on a handful of moldy rice a day. But you hold the line. You have been told your entire life that your spiritual superiority, your absolute willingness to die for the Emperor makes you invincible. You are fully prepared to do exactly that. But then, across the thick, impenetrable jungle canopy, you hear a sound. It isn't the crack of gunfire or the sharp whistle of artillery. It is the steady, relentless mechanical roar of heavy diesel engines. And then, the cruelest rumors start filtering through the surviving ranks. While you are literally chewing on tree roots to stave off starvation, your enemy just over the ridge is complaining that their ice cream isn't cold enough. This isn't some exaggerated propaganda designed to break your morale. This was the actual terrifying logistical reality of the Pacific Fleet during World War II. And when you look closely at the diaries and the first-hand accounts of the era, you realize something profound. What ultimately broke the Japanese military wasn't just the sheer volume of American bullets or the devastating power of the atomic bomb. It was a barge, a massive floating concrete ship that produced tons of ice cream an hour. And it was the crushing existential horror of fighting a nation that treated a global war like an industrial conveyor belt. And this is where it gets absolutely fascinating. You have to understand the massive fundamental doctrinal gap between these two warring empires. The Japanese military doctrine was built heavily around the concept of the decisive battle and the indomitable power of the human spirit, Bushido. They truly believed that superior willpower, martial discipline, and a samurai's absolute readiness to die could overcome any material shortage. If you fight harder, if you are more willing to perish than the man standing across from you, you will inevitably win. But the Americans, they looked at the Pacific Ocean, the largest, most unforgiving body of water on Earth, and they didn't see a spiritual proving ground. They saw a math problem, a massive, incredibly complicated logistical equation. They didn't just send armies to the front lines, they brought the entire factory with them. For the United States military, logistics wasn't just a boring rearguard support function, it was a religion. They operated on the core assumption that if you can pave a road, build a runway, and keep a mechanic fed with hot food and cold drinks, the fighting basically takes care of itself. For a Japanese soldier trained to believe that suffering purified the soul, encountering this level of mechanized, relentless comfort was completely incomprehensible. It was a violent collision of two entirely different centuries. There is perhaps no better example of this psychological shock than the story of the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. During the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the Japanese military pounded the Yorktown. They hit it with heavy bombs, causing massive structural damage, destroying bulkheads, and tearing up the flight deck. By all reasonable naval standards of the time, that ship was a floating graveyard, out of the war for months. The Japanese commanders celebrated. They were completely confident they had permanently eliminated a massive strategic threat from the board. When the crippled carrier limped back to dry dock at Pearl Harbor, experienced naval engineers assessed the damage and estimated it would take at least 3 months of intensive labor to make her seaworthy again. 3 months! Admiral Chester Nimitz gave them 3 days, 72 hours. An absolute swarm of repair crews, over 1,400 men, flooded the ship. They worked around the clock in sweltering conditions, their welding arcs lighting up the Hawaiian night. They fixed flight decks, patched holes, and entirely ignored standard peacetime protocols. And a few days later, at the critical Battle of Midway, Japanese dive bomber pilots broke through the clouds, looked down at the ocean, and felt a cold grip of terror in their chests. There was the Yorktown, fully operational, launching planes. For the Japanese pilots, it was like fighting a ghost. They had bled and died to sink this ship, and the Americans simply willed it back into existence over a long weekend. It completely shattered their strategic planning. How do you defeat an enemy that just undoes your greatest hard-fought victories in 3 days? But the true existential dread came from the dirt and the mud of the islands themselves. What would you feel if you spent months building an airfield by hand, and the enemy leveled the jungle with bulldozers in 48 hours? The Japanese would spend weeks using thousands of laborers to painstakingly carve a single dirt airstrip out of the dense jungle. It was backbreaking, agonizing work. Then, the American Seabees, the naval construction battalions, would arrive on a neighboring island, and within 48 hours, using an absolute armada of bulldozers, earth movers, and tractors, soldiers. They would lay down interlocking steel matting and have heavy bombers taking off. They didn't fight the jungle, they simply erased it. Sometimes they did this while actively under enemy sniper fire, treating the Japanese resistance not as a lethal threat, but as a minor occupational hazard slowing down their construction schedule. And then there is the ultimate symbol of this logistical nightmare. While Japanese soldiers were starving to death in isolated island garrisons, entirely cut off from their shattered supply lines, the United States Navy commissioned a specialized concrete barge. This wasn't a warship, it had no heavy guns. It cost over $1 million to build, and its sole explicit purpose was to act as a floating factory that produced over 1,000 gallons of ice cream every single shift. It roamed the Pacific Ocean, safely behind the lines, simply delivering frozen desserts to American sailors and Marines to keep their morale high. Just imagine being a high-ranking Japanese intelligence officer intercepting that piece of information. You are desperately begging Tokyo for basic medical supplies, for bandages, for a single shipment of rice to keep your men alive, and you suddenly find out your enemy has so much excess steel, so much excess fuel, and so much free time that they built a massive ship exclusively for dessert. It is a profound psychological weapon. It signals an industrial capacity so vast, so endlessly deep, that it makes your own ultimate sacrifice feel entirely, statistically irrelevant. You aren't fighting an army anymore. You are fighting a force of nature. The realization must have been utterly devastating to those who understood it. The war in the Pacific wasn't going to be decided by who had the bravest warriors, the most unbreakable spirit, or the sharpest swords. It was already decided on the roaring assembly lines of Detroit, in the sprawling shipyards of California, and on the decks of million-dollar ice cream barges. The most terrifying weapon the Americans brought to the Pacific wasn't an explosive or a firearm. It was their terrifying ability to turn the apocalypse into a mundane industrial routine, grinding their way across the ocean, one freshly paved runway and one cold dessert at a time. If this story changed the way you look at history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what crazy historical event I should cover next.